November 18, 1991. Medellín, Colombia. A quiet laboratory hidden behind a warehouse in the industrial district of Itagüí. The chemist is working late. Glass beakers glow under a harsh fluorescent lamp. Coca paste bubbles slowly inside a steel drum. Outside, the streets are silent. Then the vehicles arrive. No sirens, no warnings, just the heavy sound of doors slamming shut. Men step out, armed, silent, disciplined. They already know his name. Inside the lab, the chemist wipes his hands on a stained apron. He assumes it is routine, another inspection, another demand for higher purity. But tonight is different. The men do not ask questions. They drag him outside before he can speak. By dawn, his body will be found beside the Medellín River, execution style. No police report will mention his real role. No newspaper will explain why he had to die. Because the chemist did not betray Pablo Escobar. He did something far worse. He made a single technical decision inside a cocaine laboratory that quietly exposed one of the Medellín Cartel's most guarded secrets. A mistake so dangerous that the cartel chose murder over risk. And in doing so, they revealed something far deeper about power inside organized crime. Not loyalty, not profit, but control over knowledge. Inside the mythology of the cocaine wars, the spotlight always falls on gunmen, hitmen, bodyguards, cartel bosses. But the real engine of the cocaine empire was far quieter: chemists. By the mid-1980s, the organization built by Pablo Escobar had become the most powerful drug network in the Western Hemisphere. The Medellín Cartel controlled an estimated 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. But raw coca leaves meant nothing without chemistry. Turning coca paste into export-grade cocaine hydrochloride required precise knowledge, temperature control, solvent balance, purity calibration. Mistakes could destroy entire shipments, or worse, expose the laboratory itself. This is where the chemists came in. Most were not criminals by origin. They were trained technicians. Some had studied chemistry at small universities across Colombia. Others learned the process through trial and error in jungle laboratories hidden deep in regions like Antioquia Department. They were paid extremely well, but their position was fragile. Inside the cartel hierarchy, chemists occupied a strange middle ground. They were too valuable to replace easily, but they were never trusted.
They knew too much. They knew the formulas, the chemical suppliers, the production capacity of each laboratory. Information that, if discovered by authorities, could unravel the entire network. The chemist at the center of this story was known inside the cartel simply as El Químico. Not a public figure, not a trafficker, a technician. He spent most of his days inside a converted warehouse laboratory on the outskirts of Medellín. There, cocaine base arrived in thick, muddy bricks from jungle processing camps. His job was to transform it. Kerosene baths, acid washes, careful crystallization. By the time the product left his hands, it was pure white powder, ready to be shipped north. Every successful batch meant millions of dollars, and every improvement in purity increased the cartel's reputation among distributors in cities like Miami and New York City. For years, El Químico did his work quietly. No ambition, no politics, just chemistry. But in the world controlled by Pablo Escobar, even silence could become dangerous. Because eventually, one small adjustment inside a laboratory would trigger consequences far beyond the walls of that warehouse. Consequences that neither the chemist nor the cartel fully understood. Not yet. In the early 1980s, cocaine stopped being a regional trade. It became an industry. What began as scattered smuggling operations across Colombia rapidly evolved into a vertically integrated empire controlled by the Medellín Cartel. At the center of that transformation stood Pablo Escobar. Escobar understood something many traffickers did not. The real power was not transportation, it was production. Whoever controlled the laboratories controlled the supply, and whoever controlled supply controlled the price of cocaine in cities thousands of miles away, from Los Angeles to Miami. By 1984, the cartel had built dozens of processing laboratories hidden across the jungles and mountains surrounding Medellín. Some were temporary jungle camps, others were permanent chemical facilities disguised as agricultural warehouses. Each one required specialists, not gunmen, chemists. Men who understood solvent extraction, crystallization, and chemical purification. The chemist known as El Químico quickly proved himself indispensable. His batches were consistently cleaner, higher purity, more stable during transport. Distributors in the United States began noticing the difference. The cocaine arriving from Escobar's network carried a reputation: reliable,
Potent. Premium. Inside the cartel's internal economy, this mattered enormously. Higher purity meant higher street value. Higher street value meant larger payments returning to Medellín. Soon, El Químico was overseeing not just one laboratory, but multiple refining operations. He trained assistants, adjusted formulas, standardized procedures. A quiet architect behind the cartel's chemical consistency. But success inside the Medellín cartel carried a dangerous side effect: visibility. The more important a man became, the more attention he attracted, from rivals, from investigators, and from the cartel leadership itself. Escobar valued competence, but he feared knowledge. Anyone who understood the inner workings of the cocaine production chain possessed something potentially threatening: information. Where the chemicals came from, how the laboratories operated, how the product could be traced. For years, El Químico remained protected by his usefulness. But by the early 1990s, something began changing. Authorities in Bogotá and Washington, D.C. were no longer just chasing traffickers. They were studying the cocaine itself. Chemical signatures, solvent residues, production markers. And somewhere inside the laboratory in Itagüí, a small adjustment to the refining process would soon give investigators exactly what they needed: a trace, a fingerprint, a scientific path leading back to the cartel. By early 1991, the war between the Medellín cartel and law enforcement had intensified. Escobar's empire was under pressure from every direction: military operations, DEA surveillance, and rival cartels eager to exploit any weakness. Inside one of the most secure laboratories in Itagüí, El Químico made a decision that would change everything. It was a minor technical choice: a different solvent, a slightly altered crystallization temperature, nothing he would have considered risky. The adjustment improved yield. The cocaine was purer, more stable during transport. To El Químico, it was just science. But to investigators, it was a signature, a unique chemical fingerprint. For decades, law enforcement had struggled to trace shipments back to their source. Cocaine was anonymous, indistinguishable across labs. But this small change created a subtle, identifiable pattern. Residues, impurity ratios, solvent remnants, all of it pointed to a single source. In Washington, analysts in the DEA's laboratories began noticing the anomaly. By mid-1991, they could link multiple U.S. seizures directly to the Medellín labs. Escobar did not know this yet. Inside the cartel, the decision created suspicion. Chemical anomalies were dangerous. They could lead authorities straight to the production sites. And the cartel was paranoid. Every mistake, every deviation,
Every trace could become a death sentence.
El Químico was unaware he had crossed a threshold. He was no longer just a technician, he had become a liability. By October, whispers started. Audits of laboratory procedures, unannounced inspections, veiled threats from lieutenants. Escobar's paranoia, already legendary, was sharpened by the specter of U.S. pressure. One minor chemical tweak had turned a quiet, productive laboratory into a focal point of internal terror. And in November, that fear would manifest in the most brutal way possible. The same knowledge that made El Químico invaluable now marked him for death. Science, in the wrong hands, or even the right hands at the wrong time, could be lethal inside a cartel. By late 1991, the situation in Colombia had grown volatile. The Medellín Cartel no longer operated in isolation. Every shipment, every laboratory, every financial transaction had become a chess piece in a broader political game. The Colombian government, under pressure from the U.S. State Department and the Drug Enforcement Administration, intensified efforts to dismantle the cocaine empire. Anti-narcotics units were receiving sophisticated intelligence, including chemical reports that could now pinpoint production sites, a breakthrough triggered by the subtle chemical signature left by El Químico. Escobar perceived these developments not merely as law enforcement pressure, but as a direct political threat. Colombia was under the international microscope. U.S. politicians demanded results. Colombia's president at the time, Cesar Gaviria, faced mounting pressure to arrest Escobar or face diplomatic repercussions. Bombings, assassinations, and public terror campaigns had already fractured civil order. Now the cartel's laboratories themselves could be compromised. Inside Medellín, the stakes were personal. Cartel lieutenants understood that chemical traces could no longer remain invisible. Any sign of irregularity could trigger investigations, raids, and arrests. A minor miscalculation in a lab was no longer a technical concern, it was a national security problem. El Químico had inadvertently become a political liability. Law enforcement's newfound ability to trace cocaine flows meant that every batch he refined could be linked back to the heart of Escobar's operations. Each shipment could become a target for raids. Escobar's paranoia intensified. To him, the chemist's mistake was not an accident, it was a threat to the entire empire, the stability of Medellín, and ultimately his survival. Political pressure outside Colombia amplified the internal paranoia inside it. Knowledge had become a weapon, and El Químico held it. By November 18, 1991, the cartel had decided that no technical error, no matter how minor, was survivable. The political game and the criminal empire converged. A single chemist, whose genius had built millions in profits, now stood at the crossroads of death. Science, politics, and crime were intertwined, and in the Medellín of 1991, the consequences of crossing that line were immediate, irreversible, and lethal. By mid-November 1991, El Químico was no longer the invisible artisan behind the empire. Inside the Medellín cartel, whispers began circulating. A chemist who altered procedures without explicit approval was not just careless, he was dangerous. Cartel operations relied on fear as much as loyalty. Escobar's lieutenants, trained in intimidation and execution, monitored everyone, looking for weakness or deviation. El Químico's mistake was minor, but in the context of heightened U.S. pressure and chemical tracing, it became a symbol of vulnerability.
Suddenly, trusted associates began avoiding him. Couriers who once delivered raw coca to his labs now hesitated. Assistants once taught by him were reassigned. Even his own records were quietly audited. El Químico could feel it. The invisible walls of trust were closing in. Isolation is deadly inside a cartel. A man alone is a man exposed. And paranoia spreads faster than bullets. Escobar himself rarely intervened directly. Instead, he let suspicion fester, letting lieutenants determine loyalty and the consequences of perceived disloyalty. Then came subtle betrayals. Lab schedules were leaked, deliveries were redirected, communications were monitored. The chemist, so central to production, began realizing that he was being watched more closely than ever before. Every decision he made, every batch he refined, was scrutinized not just for quality, but for loyalty. Escobar's philosophy was simple: no one knows more than they should. Knowledge was power, and power outside his direct control was a threat. El Químico had crossed that invisible line. Competence had turned into liability. By the time the cartel decided he could no longer be trusted, the chemist was effectively a ghost inside the empire he had helped build. No allies, no warnings, only the quiet inevitability of internal judgment. The stage was set. Betrayal had not yet been spoken, but it had already been enacted. The machinery of execution was assembling, silent, precise, and unstoppable. In Medellín, knowledge was currency, but in the wrong hands, it was a death sentence. November 18, 1991. Medellín's industrial district was cloaked in fog. The streets outside the warehouse laboratory in Itagüí were quiet, almost unnervingly so. El Químico arrived early, as always, expecting another routine day. Inside, beakers steamed, solutions bubbled. The air smelled of chemicals and kerosene, a familiar, almost comforting scent. He did not notice the subtle changes in the lab that morning: extra locks on the supply doors, unmarked vehicles parked across the street, shadows moving with disciplined precision. The men arrived silently. Escobar never sent threats directly. He relied on fear to do the talking. These were professionals: discipline over brutality, efficiency over spectacle. Two lieutenants stepped inside first. They addressed him politely, almost deferentially, masking the inevitability of their purpose. El Químico did not resist. He did not scream. He understood only dimly why he was being singled out. Too late to plead, too late to explain. His hands, once instruments of creation, were now useless against the weight of Escobar's paranoia. He was led outside. The fog muffled the city's distant sounds. The air was cold, the silence absolute. No witnesses, no one would interfere. A single shot ended the life of the man whose work had built millions, whose mistakes had exposed the empire to scrutiny. His body was left near the Medellín River, execution style. Clean, precise, a warning and a statement simultaneously. Inside the cartel, the message was clear. Competence without unquestioned loyalty was fatal. Escobar's empire relied not just on fear, but on control of knowledge. The chemist's brilliance, once celebrated, had become a liability too great to ignore. By evening, investigators would find the body, but the significance of the murder would remain hidden. The DEA and Colombian police would later uncover the chemical fingerprints, piecing together the small mistake that had sealed his fate. Murder in the Medellín Cartel was both consequence and communication. It punished, it educated, it reminded everyone that power is maintained not merely by money or violence, but by absolute domination over information. El Químico's death marked the brutal intersection of science, loyalty, and fear, a cautionary tale that would echo far beyond the walls of the lab. The morning after the execution, Medellín stirred as if nothing had happened. Street vendors set up their stalls, children walked to school. Life moved on, oblivious to the precision killing that had occurred in the industrial district. Inside the Medellín Cartel, the ripple effects were immediate but quiet. Other chemists and laboratory specialists recognized the message. Errors, no matter how small, were deadly. The line between competence and culpability had never been thinner. Fear became the invisible instructor in every lab.
Meanwhile, investigators in Bogota and Washington slowly began connecting dots. Chemical analysis of seized cocaine revealed the unique fingerprint introduced by El Químico. Every batch traced back to his laboratories provided authorities with a roadmap into the cartel's operations. By 1992, DEA analysts were using these chemical signatures to map the distribution networks of Medellín cocaine across the United States. The very process that had once increased the cartel's profits now became a tool against them. Production secrets that had cost a man his life were now the foundation of law enforcement strategy. Escobar's empire remained formidable, but the incident highlighted a vulnerability. Knowledge, once concentrated in a single individual, could either secure power or trigger downfall. Within the cartel, the execution of El Químico reinforced obedience, yet it could not erase the trace of his work. Publicly, the death was a footnote. A chemist killed quietly in the shadows. Privately, it was a lesson in the lethal calculus of information control. The Medellín Cartel had eliminated the immediate threat, but in doing so, it had handed investigators a new weapon. Science, secrecy, and death were intertwined in ways that even the most ruthless criminals could not fully anticipate. The chemist was gone, but his mistake would continue to haunt the empire he had helped build. The story of El Químico is often reduced to a footnote in the grand narrative of the Medellín Cartel. A chemist executed for a minor technical error. Yet, beneath that simplicity lies a deeper truth about organized crime. Power is never absolute. Violence enforces compliance. Money fuels ambition, but knowledge carries a weight far heavier than any gun. The more one knows, the more dangerous one becomes. And in a world ruled by paranoia and fear, knowledge is both currency and curse. El Químico created value with his hands. He expanded an empire without ever holding a weapon. Yet the same expertise that enriched the cartel also exposed it. His death reveals the cruel paradox at the heart of organized crime. Those most essential to its survival are often the most expendable. History is rarely kind to those who operate in the shadows. The chemist's work lived on, imprinted in chemical traces across continents. Investigators traced his fingerprints not on walls or doors, but in molecules. Science became testimony. His mistake, small and technical, became a catalyst for law enforcement breakthroughs, demonstrating that even the mightiest empires are vulnerable to the subtleties of human error. In the end, Medellín remained haunted, not just by bullets and fear, but by the knowledge that control over information is the truest measure of power. El Químico's story returns us to that foggy morning by the Medellín River, a reminder that in the calculus of crime, the smallest choices can carry the deadliest consequences. Control is illusion, knowledge is power, and the quietest men often leave the loudest echoes.